Under blinding lights in Congress, Jasmine Crockett stands face to face with Ivanka Trump. Two women, two worlds colliding. Cameras capture every heartbeat as millions watch, waiting for the truth to cut through privilege. One letter, three haunting lines, and the cries of children echo louder than politics. In a nation divided, this hearing is not policy, it's a test of conscience. So what happens when silence meets justice? And which side of the moral wall will America choose? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The white light slammed down over the chamber, cold and merciless, as if the entire room was under interrogation. Dozens of cameras locked onto the witness table, every lens waiting for blood. Jasmine Crockett sat rigid, a young congresswoman with the steel of a civil rights lawyer carved into her face. In front of her, the red folder lay like a live grenade, silent but ready to explode. She didn't blink, didn't move, as if the weight of justice itself pressed her spine straight against the chair. The doors burst open and Ivanka Trump swept in her white dress, blazing under the lights, her expression carved from ice. She moved like royalty in enemy territory, chin. High eyes narrowed her very presence, dripping with untouchable privilege. Reporters craned forward, pens, scratching furiously while senators leaned back as though the show had just begun. The air was electric, every second pulling tighter. Ivanka reached the microphone, smirk curling with venom. Congresswoman Crockett fights harder for illegals than for Americans. Gasps ripped through the chamber, Republican senators chuckling darkly. The cameras cut to Jasmine, still fierce, unshaken. This was no policy debate. This was war morality against dynasty, truth against power, live before a nation. The chamber was still vibrating from Ivanka's insult when she leaned forward again, seizing the microphone like a blade. Her voice was cold, her rhythm deliberate, each word cutting with the confidence of someone born into power. This is not about compassion, she declared. This is about law and order. Our families live in fear because of open borders. Congresswoman Crockett has become the champion of illegals, not of Americans. She defends those who break our laws while American children are left behind. The words were rehearsed, sharpened like weapons aimed to brand Jasmine as reckless and unpatriotic. Cameras turned instantly, capturing Jasmine's every move, the entire chamber, waiting for her reaction. The air grew heavy, a silence coiled tight with anticipation. Jasmine did not flinch. She didn't shout or pound the table. Instead, she moved with the calm of someone who had brought a loaded weapon into battle. Her hand slid over the red folder, opening it with slow precision. The whisper of paper echoed like the click of a safety being released. Her voice was even, each word weighted. New York Times, 2018. Zero tolerance policy. Thousands of children taken from their parents at the border. She lifted her gaze and locked it on Ivanka, her stare unyielding. This is the law you defend. Her question hit harder than any accusation, filling the chamber, with a force that made even seasoned senators shift in their seats. Without warning, the giant screens behind her came alive. The images were raw, undeniable: children behind chain-link fences, clutching thin silver blankets to their shoulders. Their faces were streaked with tears, eyes wide with fear, mouths open in cries for mothers and fathers who had vanished into detention centers. The audio followed: thin, piercing wails in Spanish and English, children begging, pleading for their parents. Gasps tore through the room. Reporters froze, mid-sentence, pens hovering uselessly above their notepads. A senator muttered under his breath, pressing his fingers to his temple. Millions of Americans watching at home felt the same blow. These were not statistics. These were children in cages. Jasmine rose slowly from her seat, her voice steady but fierce, slicing through the stunned silence. She turned directly toward Ivanka. "You insult me for defending the voiceless?" She said, her words clear, measured, and merciless. Then her hand lifted, pointing at the screen that still showed the sobbing faces of children. "But what about the voices of these children ripped away under your father's order?" The chamber shook with the weight of it. It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. The words echoed, filling the marble walls, leaving no room for escape. The cameras swung instantly to Ivanka. Her composure cracked just for a second. Her jaw tightened, eyes widening, before she forced her expression back into stone. But it was too late. The nation had seen it. She shifted stiffly in her chair, her back unnaturally rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to look unaffected, but the silence betrayed her. The chamber was dead quiet, suffocating with tension. Every eye was on her, waiting, daring her to respond. And still she said nothing. The smallest human details broke through the stillness. A senator exhaled a long, heavy sigh, shaking his head slowly as though he could no longer defend what was on the screen. A reporter at the back dropped his pen, the plastic clattering against the marble floor, startlingly loud in the silence. That noise only underscored the stillness that followed, making Ivanka's refusal to speak louder than any defense she might have given. It was the silence of guilt or of fear, and the cameras captured it all. Jasmine lowered herself back into her seat, her hand once again resting on the red folder, her expression calm, unshaken. The images remained on the screen, hammering their truth into the chamber, into the country, into the world. Ivanka sat frozen, her posture betraying the pressure pressing down on her. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. This was no longer Ivanka's performance. This was Jasmine's battlefield. The first strike had landed sharp and devastating, and the audience knew it. This was not debate. This was war, and Jasmine had forced her opponent into silence. The silence after the first blow hung heavy, broken only when Ivanka leaned forward, her voice trembling slightly but wrapped in defiance. I had no direct power over policy. I was just an advisor. She said, her tone rehearsed her words, chosen to distance herself from the cruelty on the screen. She straightened her back, forcing a mask of control, as if insisting that she had been nothing more than a spectator. The chamber waited, but Jasmine did not give her room to breathe. The transition from silence to counterattack was like a blade being unsheathed. Jasmine's hand moved calmly back to the red folder. With steady fingers, she pulled out a printed email, its black lines bold and unshakable. "An advisor, you say," she began, her voice low, sharp, every syllable landing like a strike. She raised the page into the light so the cameras could catch it, so the nation could read it. "This leaked email is from 2018. It places you directly inside the White House meeting where family separation was discussed." Gasps rose from the gallery, the tension snapping tighter. Jasmine's eyes did not leave Ivanka's face as she placed the paper flat on the table, her hand pressed down like she was pinning a lie in place. The screen behind her lit up again, displaying the subject line, the date, the names in bold. It was unmistakable, Ivanka's address listed among the participants. The chamber erupted in murmurs, voices colliding, the order of the room collapsing under the weight of proof. Jasmine cleared her throat and began to read, her voice ringing out over the chaos. "We have to stay tough, even if optics are bad." The words echoed like gunfire in the chamber, hanging in the air with brutal clarity. For a second, no one moved. Every face in the room turned toward Ivanka, the camera zooming in mercilessly. Ivanka's complexion paled. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her lips parting, but no words forming. The evidence was undeniable, and the statement was damning. Senators leaned into each other, whispers hissing like sparks across the chamber. The tension broke into outright disorder as voices shouted over one another. One senator slammed his hand on the desk and barked order. Order. Another raised his voice, demanding silence, but the command fell useless into the storm of murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, hands shaking as they tried to capture every detail. The sound of the crowd rose, echoing through the marble walls, uncontainable. Jasmine did not waver. She stood still in the middle of the storm, her presence commanding, her voice calm yet burning. She waited for the noise to reach its peak before raising her hand, silencing the room, not by force, but by weight of presence. Her gaze locked on Ivanka, her eyes narrowing, and then she delivered the strike. Tough for whom, she demanded, her tone laced with contempt. The pause that followed was deliberate, razor sharp. For children who cannot even speak English? The chamber fell quiet again, her words cutting deeper than any image, any headline, any report. Ivanka's mouth opened, but the words died in her throat. She blinked rapidly, her polished veneer faltering under the crushing spotlight. Her silence was deafening, her carefully built defenses collapsing before the nation's eyes. Viewers at home could feel it too. The weight of hypocrisy laid bare the scales of morality, tipping so hard they could never balance again. Jasmine stood over the wreckage of Ivanka's excuses, her voice the last and only sound that mattered. The cameras captured everything, the crumpled notes in Ivanka's hands, her rigid posture, the flicker of panic behind her eyes. It was no longer just testimony, it was indictment. And for the millions watching, the message was unmistakable power, and privilege had been cornered, and truth was winning. From the wreckage of the email reading, the room stayed tight, and then Ivanka snapped composure, shattering in a bright flare. She jabbed the air with a manicured finger breath quickening as she seized the microphone. Her voice went sharp enough to scratch the speakers, anger punching through the last of her polish. You're turning this into theater. You're nothing but a grandstander. She hurled the words like stones trying to bruise rather than persuade. A hush followed, brittle and expectant, as if the walls themselves leaned closer, waiting for a blow that either woman might land. Jasmine did not sit for it. Her chair rasped back, and she rose in one clean motion, spine straight, gaze steady as glass. The stillness around her gathered like a storm that had decided where to break. She let the microphones come to her, not the other way around, and breathed once. No, this isn't theater. This is testimony. The declaration hit the chamber like a gavel no one else could lift, and it rang long enough for everyone to feel it. The screen behind them answered, blooming from black into the face of a 7-year-old girl. She sat at a metal table under buzzing lights, foil blanket crinkled in her fist badge, too big for her thin neck. Her voice was small and raw as she told how an agent led her one way and her mother another, each word scraping her throat. She said the room stayed cold at night and bright like daytime, and sometimes she pretended to sleep so she would not cry. She tried to be brave, and then broke again, asking where her mother went and when she could see her. No one on screen had an answer, and the silence behind her words made them heavier. The chamber absorbed the sound the way a body absorbs an impact. A staffer sucked in a breath, a senator scraped a cuff across his eyes, and a reporter stopped writing mid-stroke. The girl's voice trembled and restarted, every wobble landing like a hammer on bone, the kind of sound that lingers after it stops. Ivanka's face turned the color of paper, the steady tremor in her hand, crawling up her arm. She stared not at the child, but at the far wall, as if distance could dissolve the picture, as if looking away could make it less real. The cameras rode in close and hung there unblinking and merciless, recording the moment frame by frame. Jasmine lifted her arm and pointed straight at the screen, the gesture clean and final. Her voice carried without rising a verdict disguised as a question and a wound. You insult me for caring, but you stayed silent when they screamed. The sentence cut through the marble like wire, and the child's crying threaded through it, thin and piercing. A senator's throat clicked as he swallowed, and another's pen pulled a dark blot that spread across his notes. The hearing did not move. It tightened until every breath sounded like it might break, and then it tightened more. Ivanka gathered air as if to answer, but the shape of words collapsed before they formed. Her lips parted and closed a single tremor, shaking her jaw, and she turned her eyes away from the screen. She fixed her stare on the seal above the dais, then on the glass she would not touch, then on nothing at all. The avoidance read louder than any defense, and the lenses caught its every angle. Her shoulders squared, sagged, then squared again, a mask breaking and being forced back on a rhythm of denial and panic. Across the long table, no one helped her, and no one looked away, held fast by the gravity of the scene. The room settled into the truth it could neither swallow nor refute. On one side was a child's unfixable fear preserved in a handful of minutes. On the other was a practiced face emptied by the absence of an honest sentence. The difference between them felt like a cliff edge where the floor should be. No one coughed, no chair creaked, and the light seemed to burn without sound. Pain stood in the open, and opposite it stood a silence that frightened everyone so completely. After the last image dimmed, the hearing held its breath as if the building feared its own echo. Ivanka stayed silent, both hands clamped around a glass of water until her knuckles bleached white. Condensation crept down her fingers and pooled into a bright ring on the lacquered table. She stared at that small pool as if it might swallow her, refusing to lift her eyes toward the cameras. The lights hummed, the lenses waited, and still she would not look up. The silence felt like a locked door no one could find the key to. Jasmine leaned into the microphone with a careful, even cadence that made every word carry. She opened a slim insert inside the red folder and drew out a stapled document crowned with a blue emblem. This is from a UNICEF report on the psychological impact of family separation, she said, and the chamber tightened again. It documents prolonged anxiety, night terrors, regressive behaviors, and deep trust injuries that follow children for years. She turned a page and traced a paragraph with the edge of her finger, letting the cameras find the text. Her gaze never left the paper, but her presence commanded the room. She kept her tone low, but she did not soften the edges of the findings. The report states that chronic stress from forced separation alters how a young brain processes fear, she continued. It notes spikes in hypervigilance, bedwetting in older children, and abrupt loss of language confidence when caregivers disappear. Another passage described headaches that never quite leave stomach pain, that blooms before school, and the way sleep stops being a refuge. She added that the report observed guilt in the children who could not protect younger siblings and anger that turned inward when no adult would answer. The words felt like weights being set carefully on the table one after another. Across the dais, a senator lifted halfway from his chair and then sat as if pressed down by the evidence. Reporters hovered over their notebooks, pens hanging uselessly above the paper, afraid to cheapen what had just been named. Jasmine glanced once at Ivanka's bowed head and returned to the page, unwilling to let the gravity drift. Her next line came softer, close to the mic, a sentence laid like a hand on a trembling shoulder. Being American isn't about bloodlines. It's about humanity. Ivanka's grip tightened. The rim of the glass tapped the wood, a delicate clink that traveled across the hush. She swallowed and kept her gaze down, as if lifting it would force a reckoning she could not command. The cameras drifted closer and recorded the tremor at her wrist, the brittle set of her mouth, and the way control turned into labor. Jasmine did not press the advantage. She left the quiet intact and allowed the evidence to hold the floor. The lights steadied, the air cooled, and the gallery listened to its own breathing. The imbalance between pain and excuse was visible now, like a tilted stage no one could straighten. Jasmine stacked the pages and rested her palm on them, pinning the facts to the table like a map that would not fold away. She said plainly that reports like this were not theory, but testimony written in symptoms, sleeplessness, and the small rituals children invent to survive. She noted that the timelines described separation, detention, release did not end at a gate. They stretched into mornings, lunches, homework, and birthdays that never felt safe again. Around her, the audience exhaled in one long breath that did not quite reach the bottom of the lungs. The tempo dropped not from weakness, but from respect for the harm that had been named. The room understood this was the breath before the key detail, and it held that breath together. Then Jasmine reached for the single page she had saved for last, and the room tightened, as if it knew what was coming. She slid a hand inside the red folder's inner sleeve and lifted out a creased sheet, the pencil lines pressed hard enough to shine under the lights. "This is a handwritten letter from a 10-year-old boy," she said, holding it where the cameras could see the slanting script. "He wrote it from a detention facility and sent it to Congress in 2019. The paper was thin edges, tattered, a smudge where a thumb had lingered. In the corner, a doodled star trailed off into a dark scratch, as if it had been folded and unfolded 100 times. Jasmine steadied the page on the table, and the microphones picked up the faint rasp of paper against wood. She did not dramatize. She lowered her voice until the room had to lean in. Her eyes traced the lines once, then she read exactly as written. "Please, I want my mom. I am not bad. I am scared." The sentence hung there, 3 short blows that emptied the chamber of every other sound. Jasmine let the silence hold, as if the letter itself had asked for space to breathe, like a lung after a run. Only then did she add that the boy had signed his first name and drawn a small box he called a house. Murmurs rose like heat off asphalt, fast and unsteady, then broke into a low, injured buzz. A senator at the far end bowed his head and pinched the bridge of his nose, eyes wet beneath the fluorescent glare. Another senator stared at the ceiling jaw, trembling, the posture of someone trying not to be seen. From the press row came the soft skid of a chair, a muffled cough, the scratch of a recorder being shut off, and a photographer lowered his lens. Someone whispered, "God, not as argument, but as reflex," and the word disappeared into the carpet. The marble seemed to reflect the letter's weight back at them, hard and cold. Ivanka did not look up. Her fingers tightened around her glass until a bead of water ran down and pooled under her wrist, trembling with each uneven breath. She tilted her face toward the table, hair falling like a curtain, the cameras catching the shadow under her eyes. Her expression lost its practiced shine. In its place was something raw, the haunted look of a person cornered by a truth with no safe exit, and there was nowhere left to hide. She swallowed, but no words followed, and the microphones, greedy for sound, captured only the small click in her throat. Every second she kept her gaze down made the moment longer, heavier, impossible to escape. Jasmine lifted the letter again and set it on a stand so the script filled the screens behind her. She said the boy's grammar would not be corrected for the record because pain does not need polishing to be believed. She said paper like this travels farther than speeches, that a child's fear crosses rooms where politics usually wins. She said the image of this page should outlive the broadcast because the fear that wrote it will outlive the news cycle, not for a day, but for years. No one argued. There was nothing to argue with that was not a child's voice. The room understood that the page had become more than evidence. It had become witness. A few minutes earlier, Ivanka had parried with distance and titles. Now distance-failed titles shrank, and the final wall thinned to air. The letter stood where no rebuttal could reach it, a small square of truth with corners that cut. What it proved was not complicated, that harm has handwriting, and it can be read aloud. What it demanded was simpler still, that adults in power look up when a child says he is scared. Ivanka kept her face lowered, hands unsteady, and the cameras framed the shape of surrender without saying the word. In that frame, the last defense fell, and the letter became the symbol no one in the chamber could deny. The letter still faced the room like a small flag of truth, and the chamber held on to the quiet it demanded. Jasmine lifted the microphone without hurry, the red folder closed beneath her palm as if she were sealing a wound. She scanned the senators, then the gallery, letting the weight of the moment anchor her voice. When she spoke, it was steady, low, and final, designed to leave no gap for evasion. Policies can be changed, but scars on children last forever. She let the scent stand in the air until it felt carved into the walls, then lowered the mic without blinking. The echo folded back into the room, and with it came a different kind of silence. Ivanka sat perfectly still, the posture of defiance hollowed out from the inside. Her hands cupped the glass she had not touched, and her eyes shone rimmed with the kind of tears that come when pride is cornered. She blinked them back but did not look up. She did not offer context, defense, or apology. For once, the trained smile stayed buried, and the cameras captured a face that had run out of alibis. The stillness around her felt fragile, a sheet of ice stretched thin across a deep, cold lake. The first claps were hesitant, a scatter of palms like rain hitting stone in separate drops. A second beat followed from the gallery, and then a third, the sound finding courage as it repeated itself. The applause gathered pace until it rolled across the room, not as celebration, but as release from something too tight to breathe beneath. Jasmine did not bow or bask. She stood and absorbed the sound as a witness, not a victor. A gavel rapped once, then paused, as if even the chair feared breaking the fragile truce the words had made. Then more hands joined, and for a brief moment the chamber sounded human again. Every lens drank the contrast and sent it out in clean lines to living rooms and phones across the country. On screen, the split was unmistakable. On one side, a practiced power choosing silence. On the other, a measured voice calling names to their cost. Producers held the shot of Jasmine's set jaw against the close-up of Ivanka's downcast eyes, and the story needed no narration. Viewers could read it without captions, without graphics, without the usual chorus of talking heads. It was evasion versus accountability, dynasty versus duty, and the frame refused to flatter either side. In that frame, a nation learned something about itself, and it did not come gently. At last, the chair found his voice, and the gavel fell a final time, wooden and decisive. The hearing stood adjourned, but no one moved quickly, as if the floor had turned to water and required careful steps. Jasmine gathered the letter and slid it back into the folder with the care one gives to a living thing. Ivanka remained seated, eyes lowered, the muscles in her jaw, working on a sentence that never formed. Reporters stayed in their seats, scribbling fewer words than usual, trying not to spoil what the moment had already written. The doors opened, air moved, and yet the aftershock held steady in the bones of the room. Even as chairs scraped back and staffers began to coil cables, the line hung like smoke that refused to clear, not tonight or tomorrow or the week after. Jasmine remained near the table, steadying the letter with her fingertips, as if confirming it was still truly real in a room prone to performance. Ivanka rose slowly, almost head lowered, blinking against the glare, and the unspoken apology that never came made the lights feel harsher. Security shifted, doors breathed, and the murmur returning to the chamber sounded cautious, as though everyone feared saying the wrong thing might undo the truth for a long while. On monitors now going dark, the final frame lingered a heartbeat longer, silence on one side, testimony on the other, and a country suspended between them. The hearing had ended, but its edges stayed sharp, the kind of ending that keeps cutting long after the sound is gone, and it would not dull. The hearing adjourned, but the story stepped outside with everyone who watched. By sunrise, front pages and home screens carried one banner line in unmistakable type: Crockett versus Ivanka, the moral wall. Editors chose two stills that required no captions. Jasmine upright behind the microphone, red folder shut beneath her palm. Ivanka a half turn away, eyes wet, unable to look up. Morning anchors let the child's clip run uncut before speaking, allowing the silence to do the heavy lifting. Producers cut the usual crossfire and booked fewer guests, choosing specialists who could explain trauma without shouting. All day the headline repeated like a drumline, steady on phones, billboards, and tickers. People read it on buses and at kitchen tables, and felt the room change for all to see around the words. Regional papers matched the headline and added local details, but none softened its spine. Commute radio replayed the exchange at the top of each hour, leaving long pauses for a driver to think at red lights. A national magazine printed a black cover with the headline alone, trusting plain text to carry an argument everywhere. Evening broadcasts opened with a split screen and no music, letting viewers sit in the ache without distraction. Producers kept their chirons sparse so the footage could breathe and speak for itself. In living rooms, remote controls stopped moving, and households watched without commentary of their own on screens nationwide. Commentary moved from tactics to conscience and stayed there. Pediatric specialists described how chronic stress trains a child's brain to expect danger even in safe rooms. Immigration lawyers translated bureaucratic language into home-level consequences, stripping the varnish from words like processing and transfer. A former agent admitted the policy satisfied statutes while failing the oldest test in public life: right versus wrong. A civil rights historian placed the moment in the lineage of testimonies that turn a country's wheel by a fraction. Panelists who usually sparred kept their voices, even as if the clip set a rule that noise would not be needed. Jasmine declined most invitations and chose one plain studio with a neutral backdrop. When the host asked whether she felt victorious, she answered that victory is the wrong word to stand beside a child's fear. She said accountability lives in decisions made after cameras leave, not in applause lines or trending charts. Then she listed 3 steps that sounded like work: not branding, oversight calendars, trauma resources, contractor audits. The host blinked at the specificity and thanked her for bringing verbs instead of slogans. The clip circled again, proof that steadiness can be as compelling on screen as fury. Lower thirds began labeling her voice of justice, first as a caption and then as a spoken descriptor. She never claimed the phrase. She redirected it, saying the voice belongs to anyone who chooses truth over comfort. Her staff posted a 1-page guide for documenting harm without spectacle, free to copy and adapt. Community groups passed the PDF between phones like a field manual, circling actions that turn outrage into work. She held short calls with legal aid clinics and asked what they needed before promising anything. Logistics, not applause, became the shape of her influence, and people recognized the difference. Ivanka, meanwhile, met a colder current when she sat for a soft interview meant to steady her. The host offered the gentlest bridge possible and asked what she would say to that child today. She answered with polished qualifiers about process complexity and hindsight, never naming a meeting or decision. Editors clipped the exchange and added 4 spare words beneath her name: complicit in silence. She never spoke those words, but the caption fit the scene like a diagnosis. The segment rebroadcast across networks, and the label followed her into each replay. Think pieces tried to complicate the headline, and failed because simplicity kept winning. Crockett versus Ivanka. The moral wall did not describe a feud. It named a line anyone could see. On one side stood a calm record of harm. On the other stood a quiet that shielded it until the lights arrived. Analysts mapped the hearing's pivot points from insult to evidence, posture to document argument to witness. They froze the frame where the handwritten letter filled the screen like a lighthouse through weather. Readers recognized the sequence without help, and the essays landed like confirmations rather than discoveries. In offices where policy feels like chess, the memo traffic changed tone. One note demanded a full inventory of detention contracts, identifying which must end and by what timeline. Another ordered mental health staffing for facilities holding minors, treating trauma as a cost that cannot be exported. A third tracked agencies drafting guideline updates under pressure that was moral first and political second. Staff who once practiced talking points began practicing listening because the cameras had taught what carries. Meeting rooms sounded different when the clip played in the back of every head, like an alarm that would not snooze. City rooms and kitchen tables adopted the headline as shorthand for an idea they already believed, but had not named. A teacher taped the words by a classroom door and asked students to write what justice looks like on a Tuesday. A nurse pinned the line above a break room sink and scheduled training to spot anxiety before it becomes stomach pain. A bus driver wrote the phrase on masking tape above the dashboard and touched it before each route like a pledge. A pastor quoted the headline in a homily and said faith without listening is just theater. No one needed exclamation marks. The sentence carried its own voltage across rooms of every size. The lesson took shape slowly, like a picture resolving as you step back. Do not stay quiet when harm is done in your name, if your quiet keeps you comfortable. Witness is not neutral. It either stiffens harm or weakens it. Silence is a policy even when it dresses itself as decorum or timing. People repeated those lines not as slogans, but as rules of the road they wanted to keep. They sounded less like politics and more like parenting, medicine, teaching, and careful driving. Reporters asked Jasmine whether the voice of justice label felt heavy and whether she feared the pedestal. She replied that the label feels shared, not personal, and she will measure it by whether children sleep easier. She said the phrase matters less than the follow-through behind it: audits, finished hearings, scheduled letters answered. She promised to keep choosing documents over adjectives because paper keeps promises better than speeches. She thanked editors for airing the child's testimony uncut and said choosing a frame is a moral act. The interview ended without cheers, only a steady nod that traveled farther than applause. A quieter debate opened about forgiveness and apology, and it crossed directly through Ivanka's silence. Some argued that tears speak when words cannot, while others said tears without ownership protect the speaker. Editorials proposed a hard but humane standard apology must name the injury and the actor, or it is only weather. Opinion pages did not demand contrition. They demanded clarity about responsibility. Measured against that yardstick, complicit in silence read less like a jab and more like a diagnosis to avoid. The phrase glued itself to the footage and would not peel off in subsequent segments. By week's end, the headline had traveled farther than most campaign slogans because it asked for conscience, not allegiance. People remembered where they were when they first heard the line about scars that never fade. They repeated it to children at doorways, to co-workers over coffee, and to themselves after the lights clicked off. It fit in a single breath and changed how a listener stood in their kitchen. The country did not agree on everything, but it agreed on this: children are not collateral for anyone's narrative. That agreement felt like ground finally holding after weeks of political rain. The moral of the week resisted marble words and stayed close to the ground. Power can move fast without moving right. Empathy moves right before it moves fast. Institutions answer to pressure, and pressure works best when it is stubborn, informed, and decent. Cameras can be instruments of care when they refuse to blink at the wrong moment. The opposite of cruelty is not sentiment but responsibility strong enough to pick up what power drops. Those 5 sentences could close a book and leave the light on. In the end, the image that lingered was a clean split screen sent nationwide and saved on countless phones. On the left, a public servant speaking in a register that never rose and never wavered. On the right, a famous face learning the cost of saying nothing when saying something mattered. Voice of justice no longer sounded like flair. It felt like a role any citizen could borrow for a minute. Complicit in silence no longer sounded like a taunt. It read as a warning label no one wants near their name. The credits did not roll, but the lesson landed simple, durable, and hard to forget today. The coverage settled into the bones of the city overnight, and by morning the pressure it built pushed straight through Capitol doors. Inside, senior members convened in a no-frills conference room and agreed on one step that could not be spun an independent investigation into the separation policy. A formal resolution dropped at noon, instructing council to act outside partisan staff and to report findings to the public. Subpoena authority was granted on page 1, preservation orders on page 2, and a mandate for child welfare experts on page 3. The scope read like a MAP policy design sign-off chain contractor participation facility conditions and the paper trail that led from draft to execution. No one argued that the cameras forced their hand. They simply acknowledged that the letter had made delay obscene. Mechanics followed rhetoric with the speed of embarrassment. Council served notice to agencies to freeze deletions, capture emails and mirror servers for a clean chain of custody. Calendar pulls began, text exports queued, and travel logs were requested to test who sat where, when, and for how long. Depositions were scheduled at staggered intervals. Agents, supervisors, contractors, medical staff, each sworn, recorded, and indexed by theme. Analysts built a timeline on a wall-sized screen, red pins for orders, blue for warnings, yellow for ignored memos that read like sirens. No podiums, no sound bites, just the slow, heavy work of assembling truth until it can stand on its own. The politics did not disappear, but the usual theater shrank. Committee leaders repeated a plain sentence: children are not a partisan category, and let it do the lifting. The ranking member asked for guardrails and got them: public releases, minority counsel, visibility, and an audit of council's budget. The chair added a rule against grandstanding during depositions, a quiet nod to the hearing that started the fire. Members who once leaned on law and order found the phrase "too thin for the pictures" now in circulation. In its place came a smaller word duty that left less space for slogans and more for signatures. With the doors open, the whistle began to sing. Field nurses filed declarations about night terrors and weight loss. Case managers logged the days it took to find parents across borders and languages. A transport contractor surrendered chain of custody slips with times that did not match the van logs, and a supervisor resigned before his interview could begin. Agents from the line, some anonymous, described the moment the new policy arrived as an email, with no training, only quotas. One interpreter attached a list of phrases a child uses when scared that never show up in official forms. Piece by piece, the picture that the letter started grew teeth, dates, voices, and names. Outside the marble, the public moved with the simplicity of a hand on a doorknob. A petition went live before lunch and crossed 100,000 signatures in an hour. By afternoon, it read like a street in motion. Its demand was tight: a compensation fund for affected families, funded by agencies and contractors who executed or profited from separation. The second line asked for trauma care, school supports, and legal services, not as charity, but as restitution for policy-made harm. The third line named documentation records, correction fee waivers, and travel help for reunions that cost more than most families carry. Nothing in it shouted. It simply lined up what the country now saw and asked it to pay the bill. The comments beneath the petition became a ledger of witness. One entry said, "We found our son after 19 months. He does not sleep without a light." Another read, "I am a teacher. 3 of my students flinch when the intercom crackles." A grandmother wrote, "He will not hug anyone but his sister. We learn not to ask why." At a library table, volunteers printed sheets for neighbors without internet and slid clipboards across polished wood. In multiple languages, signatures piled in careful handwriting, and the rush felt less like a crowd and more like a vow. Money talk followed, not as a dodge, but as the proof that care was serious. Civil rights lawyers drafted a restitution framework modeled on funds used after public disasters. Economists suggested a trust seeded by federal appropriation and repaid by a surcharge on relevant contracts for a fixed term. Hospitals proposed clinic hours reserved for affected families, with interpreters, child psychologists, and case managers under one roof. Philanthropic groups matched the first tranche with conditions transparency dashboards, short waiting times, and zero means testing for minors. No one pretended cost was small. They argued cost was the least expensive part of the debt. Watchdog groups turned the headlines into checklists that refused to fade. They mapped vendors, beds transport, food surveillance, and graded each on transparency and care. A public portal opened for claims in multiple languages with a hotline answered by trained humans, not recordings. Tech workers built a simple upload tool that time-stamped receipts, tickets, and medical notes so proofs would not vanish again. Law clinics hosted paper days where families walked out with copies that finally belonged to them. The moral wall turned into a ramp of paperwork, and at last the slope tilted toward those who had been climbing it alone. On the ground, help took shapes as ordinary as a gym and as careful as a clinic. City rec centers ran weekend reunification sessions, long tables, translators, case managers, trauma counselors. Parents arrived with plastic bags of documents and someone explained what each page meant and where it had to go next. A donated van looped between shelters in the center so a bus schedule would not decide a child's future. A nurse handed out earplugs and sleep masks and explained why darkness is too loud for some kids now. When the day ended, volunteers stacked chairs in quiet because gratitude felt heavy and words felt small. In that same week, invitations chased Jasmine across inboxes she did not give out. Human rights groups asked her to speak not because she was viral, but because she was precise. She accepted a handful and declined the rest, saying she would not trade paperwork for podiums. When she did step on a stage, the venue went quiet without being told, and the red folder sat beside the mic like a partner. Organizers introduced her as a voice of justice, and she replied that the voice belonged to the evidence, she only carried it cleanly. The line did not flatter, it clarified the job. One auditorium carried the weight of a courtroom without the formality. Jasmine opened by reading the boy's letter again, then the sentence she had carved in the hearing, unchanged and unadorned. She told the room what oversight dates were on the calendar and where to send declarations without fear of a dead inbox. She asked for verbs print, deliver, document, translate, and the audience wrote them down like instructions on a fire door. She did not accuse voters. She deputized witnesses, which is harder and yields more. When she finished, the applause sounded like agreement rather than worship. Editorial boards sketched the lesson in pencil first, then inked it for the weekend editions. A woman without dynasty can move a wall if she leans with the right fulcrum documents, patience, and a refusal to blink. Power counted on performance. She answered with proof, and proof takes the costume off privilege. The narrative arc was almost cruel in its elegance. Insult evidence. Witness admission by silence. Nothing supernatural happened. The country simply watched the physics of conscience under light. Readers cut the pages and taped them to refrigerators like rules for a road that had forgotten its lanes. The logic, when laid end to end, looked like a lever anyone could learn to lift. Ivanka tried to stage the moment with the word grandstander, but the accusation bounced off paper that would not burn. Jasmine refused the bait and moved the forum from opinion to record, from theater to transcript. The email, the policy name, the child's voice, and the letter locked together like joints in a beam. By the time silence arrived on the other side, it did not read as poise. It read as vacancy at the center of power. What began as a sneer ended as a mirror, and the image in it would not be edited away. Congress kept its pace because the country was still looking. Subpoenas landed, calendars blocked out full days for depositions. A draft interim report took shape with headings no one could mistake. The petition crossed 1 million signatures and was delivered in boxes that rolled like luggage toward a clerk with a tired smile. Jasmine went back to committee, to phone calls, to footnotes, to the low work of making sentences enforceable. No one called the week a victory, they called it a correction, and corrections are how a record gets honest. For now, the city breathed a little deeper, not because the story ended, but because the truth had been put on paper and refused to move. The chamber closed, but the echoes refused to fade. Across the United States, dinner tables, offices, and classrooms carried the same question like a stone in their hands. Who are we if we stay silent before the cries of children? The phrase ricocheted through conversations, not as a slogan, but as an accusation. Some argued the nation had strayed from its principles, others claimed security demanded hard choices, but no one escaped the question. It sat between friends in coffee shops, it broke into arguments in kitchens, it pulsed through talk shows late at night. America found itself staring at a mirror it could not turn away from, and the reflection was split in half. The divide was sharp. One side believed Jasmine had exposed a cruelty that could never again be hidden. The other side insisted order demanded sacrifice, even from the smallest voices. But the images of the cages, the letter from the 10-year-old boy, in Jasmine's words, policies can be changed, but scars on children last forever, hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. Even those who tried to defend the policy struggled against the evidence of children weeping behind fences. Silence no longer felt like neutrality, it felt like complicity. And America was forced to ask itself whether it could endure the sound of those cries without answering. The international press sharpened the moment into history. Le Monde called it a turning point for American human rights. The Guardian printed a headline that read, "The Day America Listened to Its Children." In Germany, Der Spiegel published an op-ed that described the testimony as a crack in the armor of dynastic privilege. Al Jazeera broadcast clips of the hearing on repeat, framing it as proof that American democracy could still hold its leaders to account. Even in capitals where the United States was often criticized for hypocrisy, there was a rare admission this moment mattered. The footage of Ivanka's silent eyes lowered was replayed across Europe, Asia, and Latin America, as if it were an emblem of accountability. World leaders commented carefully, but their words carried weight. A Canadian minister tweeted, "This is why testimony matters, because children cannot wait for politics to be convenient." A human rights envoy from the European Union said bluntly, "If America changes course here, it will be because one congresswoman refused to be mocked into silence." Diplomats in Washington reported a surge in questions from foreign journalists about what the United States planned to do next. The phrase turning point appeared in dispatches so often it began to feel less like analysis and more like prophecy. At the center of it, Jasmine Crockett's name grew into something larger than a congresswoman's signature. Commentators called her the voice of conscience, the defender of the voiceless, a symbol of the generation to come. Editorials praised not just her courage, but her precision, the way she turned insult into leverage, evidence into indictment, and silence into guilt. Young activists replayed her words on TikTok. Teachers quoted her in classrooms and civil rights groups, invited her to keynote events once reserved for long-established icons. Jasmine didn't ask for the role, but it was handed to her, the embodiment of what it meant to stand steady and unbroken before privilege and refuse to bow. For Ivanka, the story ended differently. She did not return to the stage or the microphone. Invitations dried up, appearances canceled quietly. Her public schedule emptied until nothing remained. Paparazzi caught her once outside a Manhattan townhouse, sunglasses covering her eyes, head lowered, as she moved quickly to a waiting car. Commentators described it as a retreat into silence. To some, it looked like shame. To others, a calculated withdrawal to protect what was left of her brand. But the cameras had already carved the image that would define her legacy, a powerful woman who could not find words when children cried. That frame followed her everywhere, louder than any statement she might have made. The nation, meanwhile, began to imagine what could come next. Commentators warned that this hearing was not an end, but a beginning, a doorway into other rooms where privilege had long gone unchallenged. Talk shows speculated about future investigations, about what other secrets could be pried loose by the persistence of testimony and the pressure of conscience. This is a chapter one analyst said on Primetime, not the book. What we saw was the opening of a door. And that door promised more confrontations, more reckonings, where truth and justice would once again meet power head-on. But beneath the noise, a simple lesson settled into the public mind, carried by Jasmine's words in the child's letter. Strength, people realized, is not inherited in gold towers or passed down through family names. It does not live in a brand or a dynasty. Real strength is the voice that rises when it would be easier to stay silent. Real strength is choosing to defend those who cannot defend themselves. A dynasty's silence had cracked before a single congresswoman's testimony, and that imbalance told its own story. Power built on inheritance can tremble. Power built on justice does not. The moral felt less like politics and more like human law. Parents repeated it to their children, speak when you see wrong. Teachers wrote it on whiteboards, silence is not neutral. Preachers wove it into sermons to protect the weak is not theater, it is testimony. The boy's letter, please I want my mom, I am not bad, I am scared, became the kind of line a nation memorizes not because it is poetry, but because it is truth. And Jasmine's words stood beside it, chiseling themselves into memory. Policies can be changed, but scars on children last forever. In the end, America stood divided, but no longer able to look away. The hearing forced a reckoning, not with policy, but with identity. The international community called it a turning point, the press called it the moral wall, and the people called it what it was, a moment when one woman armed only with evidence and conviction shattered the silence of a dynasty. Ivanka retreated, Jasmine rose, and the story ended not with closure, but with a door left wide open for the next hearing, the next reckoning, the next time truth would step onto the stage to face power. Because the lesson remained carved in stone, real strength does not come from inherited names or golden privilege. It comes from the voice that refuses to abandon the weak. And America had been reminded brutally and beautifully that the sound of justice always begins with one person daring to speak when silence is safer. The door from that hearing stayed open, and the question stepped through with us. In the days that followed, one truth kept ringing like a steady bell. Silence can be comfortable, but it is never neutral. The most human lesson is painfully simple: when children cry, adults answer. Not with slogans, not with branding, but with the kind of care that leaves a paper trail. Jasmine's line carved it into the country's ribs. Policies can be changed, but scars on children last forever. If pain can last a lifetime, then conscience must last longer. That is the heart of the moral, and it is not theoretical. Dignity for a child is not a sentiment. It is a set of decisions made on ordinary days by ordinary people. We learn that citizenship is not about bloodlines, it is about duty, and duty is only real when it is exercised. We learn that power without empathy is a costume, and empathy without action is a lullaby. When a policy wounds a child, the only measure that matters is whether we stop the harm and repair what we can. Everything else is theater that should not survive the credits. So here is the plain invitation and the hard command: become a witness who does things, not a spectator who feels things. If you know an immigrant family in your neighborhood, ask what documentation they need: copied, translated, notarized, or safely stored. If your school has children flinching at the bell, advocate for trauma-informed practices in a quiet room where bodies can calm down. If your community center has nothing posted in Spanish, Vietnamese, or Arabic, start with a sign and do not stop at a sign. Say it out loud without hedging: children are not bargaining chips. Say it again where it counts: children are not bargaining chips. At the kitchen table, make the lesson small enough to live in a child's pocket and big enough to survive a headline. Tell your kids that bravery often sounds like telling the truth when it trembles. Read the news with them and ask who needed help in this story and what could we do. Call a teacher and ask what the classroom needs to help anxious kids breathe: earplugs, soft lamps, a corner that isn't fluorescent. If you sit on a school board, move a vote for counselor hours and translation services before the semester locks. Every tiny safeguard you install becomes a bridge back to safety for someone else's child. At street level, build the web that catches families before they fall through. Organize a paper day at the library where volunteers scan IDs, asylum notices, and court slips, then hand copies back in labeled folders. Recruit bilingual neighbors into a small translation corps and rotate hours so no one burns out. Coordinate rides to clinics and hearings, because justice missed for want of a bus is not justice. Start a micro-grant fund that pays for birth certificates, filing fees, or the last-mile tickets that reunite families. Put a phone number on the flyer that is answered by a human, not a maze. In civic life, treat your voice like a tool with settings for precision. Call your representatives and ask for 3 specifics: independent oversight with subpoena power, a timeline for reunification, and a permanent ban on family separation. Follow up in writing, because paper is hard to bury, and CC your local paper, so the question lives outside your inbox. Attend the town hall and bring the sentence that refuses to fade. Policies can be changed, but scars on children last forever. Then ask the official to repeat it into the microphone. Track their votes and set a reminder for 90 days to check progress against promises. If the answer you get is fog answer with a list, dates, and a crowd, online choose to be the kind of presence that turns evidence into light rather than heat. Share the clip or the document without turning a child's pain into spectacle or bait. Blur faces is strip metadata and never post names that put kids in danger. Protecting the vulnerable is part of the testimony. When you see disinformation, quote the source document and the line number rather than adding volume. Archive pages file public records requests and teach friends how to preserve proof so truth does not vanish when a link dies. Remember that clicks are not the work. They are only the doors to it. In your workplace, move from sympathy to policy. Ask HR to approve paid volunteer hours for legal aid clinics or reunification logistics, and then measure whether anyone actually uses them. If you manage teams, post a clear path for employees affected by family separation to access time counseling and legal support without stigma. Hospitals and clinics can designate trauma slots for children with separation histories and staff them with interpreters first, not as an afterthought. Faith communities can open their halls for document clinics, pro bono consults, and quiet rooms where people can cry without being watched. Professional codes across fields can add a line that says the same thing in different languages, children first. At the ballot box, match conscience to calendar. Listen for candidates who can list mechanisms, audits, ombuds, offices, deadlines instead of adjectives. Demand platform planks that are measurable. No detention of minors, mandatory family defenders at intake, and 90-day reunification clocks that trigger automatic review. Vote your paper trail, not your anger, and then keep the receipts, screenshots of promises, clips of votes, and records of emails that went unanswered. When the new session opens, send the packet back with a handwritten note, "We are still watching." Democracy is not a mood, it is a maintenance schedule. In the media we consume and fund reward the work that treats pain with precision. Subscribe to the reporters who press pause on shouting and let the child's voice stand. Write the editor and say, "Run the transcript, not just the panel." When euphemisms creep in, processing transfer optics reply with the human words they hide, waiting removal fear. If a show tries to turn harm into a viral moment, change the channel and tell them why. We do not have to starve the spectacle. We simply have to stop feeding it. Culture carries memory farther than news, so write the lesson into art that lasts. Teachers can assign the letter as a primary source and ask students to write the policy that would have protected him. Filmmakers can shoot the quiet rooms, the copy machines, the bus rides, the part of the story that looks like work. Musicians can take the boy's line, "Please, I want my mom. I am not bad. I am scared," and build a refrain that refuses to leave a room unchanged. Pain turns into power when it is shaped into something that can be carried without breaking. Make the story portable, and it will cross more borders than any law can close. Sustainability matters more than adrenaline, so set a cadence you can keep. Choose one action for today, one for this month, and one for the year, and write them on the first page of a notebook. Join a small group that meets for 60 minutes and leaves with 2 assignments, then comes back with proofs instead of selfies. When you feel the fatigue creep in trade shifts rather than abandon the post, movements do not fail for lack of passion, but for lack of scheduling. Celebrate boring victories, scan files, notarize forms, a child sleeping through the night, because they are the bricks of justice. The story does not need heroes. It needs people who keep the checklist alive. And hold on to the posture. Jasmine modeled the one that turned a sneer into a lever. Keep a red folder real or symbolic where you put receipts, timelines, and letters that are nobody's secrets anymore. Speak in sentences that can be transcribed, because accountability lives in language that survives the echo. When insult arrives, do not take the bait. Shift the frame to evidence, to the child, to the document that cannot blush. Being American isn't about bloodlines, it's about humanity. Say it without raising your voice and watch how the room learns to listen. This is the lesson polished by the roughest hand. Strength that descends from a name is loud but brittle. Strength that rises from protecting the weak is quiet and unbreakable. A dynasty can purchase a microphone. It cannot purchase a bedtime without fear. A trademark can move a product. It cannot move a conscience. What lasts is the habit of answering the cry with a plan, the decision to swap performance for proof, the resolve to leave footprints where help actually happened. If you are looking for a side to stand on the side that keeps records and keeps promises. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.